Let's talk about the cell. We'll have a quick introduction, but most of what we'll discuss in this section is the cell membrane. So, first, cell theory. Now, keep in mind, a theory is something that all our evidence seems to be supporting. Like the general theory of relativity is how Einstein explained gravity. And seems like he's probably right. Cell theory means that what you see on this slide seems to be right. Maybe there's something in the universe we haven't discovered yet, but as far as we can tell, all living organisms are made of one or more cells. All of these cells arise from pre-existing cells, and cells are the smallest structural and functional unit of life. So what we mean by that is cells have their own organized structure, which we'll be talking about. They have their own metabolism, the ability to build things and break things down. They have their own ability to grow and to reproduce, and they are specialized for their environment and their function. And really, a lot of what we'll talk about in this class are these specializations that allow cells to make tissues, that make organs that are useful in specific environments or functions. Human cells are very diverse as well. So they have the same general structures, like even if you know that red blood cells are anucleate, they lack nuclei, well, they have them, but then they spit them out. So at one point or another, cells tend to have all the same equipment. But they can vary in lots of other ways. For example, in shape. So here on the screen, there are lots of different shapes of human cells. A sperm cell is very different than a neuron, is very different than a red blood cell. They can differ much in size as well. So cells are typically very small, and yet the longest cell in your body is a neuron that travels from the base of your spinal cord down to your toe. Your big toe, I think, is the longest one. So we're talking 3 feet or more. Pretty long cell. Replication rate. Cells can divide very quickly in some parts of your body or very slowly in other places. As an example, your stomach lining has to create new cells pretty rapidly because of the hydrochloric acid and all the churning that's going on inside your stomach. Same with your skin. As you shed or slough off skin cells, new cells have to be made. And of course, cells differ a lot in function, which we'll be talking about throughout the semester. Although you can kind of summarize cell function by saying, well, there's 2 main types of cells. Sex cells, which are called gametes, they have one function, which is to combine with another gamete to make a new human. So sperm and eggs are gametes. That's their job. The job is for the sperm to find the egg, to fertilize it, to make reproduction happen. All of your other non-gametic cells are called somatic cells. And this term soma means body. That's a good one to know because it will come up quite a bit in this class. Soma meaning body. So again, all the other cells of your body are somatic cells. Now let's get into cell anatomy. There are 3 major parts to cells: the membrane, the nucleus, and the cytoplasm. The cell membrane is sometimes also called the plasma lemma or plasma membrane. It's semi-permeable, so it means that some things can come through and others can't. We're going to talk about that in detail. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. As we mentioned, some cells, like red blood cells, will spit out their nuclei. Some other cells are multinucleate, have multiple nuclei inside. Like some of your long skeletal muscle cells have many nuclei. And cytoplasm, be careful here, depending on what you learned in the past about cytoplasm. The liquid, or really more of a gelatinous fluid inside the cells, is called cytosol. So cytoplasm is that. It is that gelatinous fluid, but it also includes the organelles, these little mini organs that take care of all the cellular functions. Now let's take a closer look at the cell membrane, starting with its functions. Number one just being that the cell membrane isolates the inside of the cell from the environment. It forms a barrier around the internal parts of the cell. If you didn't have that, we wouldn't have cells. Everything would just wash away. But the cell membrane is also selectively permeable. So this means, again, that certain things can pass in and out of the cell. Some require some assistance to move across the cell membrane, whether it be a pump or a channel, and so on. And cell membranes allow sensitivity to the environment, including other cells, using receptors that are often found embedded in the cell membrane. And the cell membrane assists with communication between cells, adhesion, meaning the attachment of cells to other cells, and structural support for the cell. Some of these we'll look at in more detail than others. Now, the structure of the cell membrane is often referred to as a phospholipid bilayer. You've probably heard this term, but just as a refresher, that means that the cell membrane has a bunch of these phosphate heads and these fatty acid tails. So what I've drawn here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 phospholipids. But the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer, so I need 2 layers of phospholipids to form my bilayer. So now perhaps this is the outer environment, and there are some solutes floating around out here. And if those solutes cross both layers of phospholipids, then they'll access the inside of the cell. So it's good to be able to draw this out and to recognize that the fatty acid tails are hydrophobic, so they're kind of hiding with each other. And the phosphate heads are hydrophilic. And phil means to love. So like philanthropy, someone who's a philanthropist loves to help people. Phil, to love. Anthros, people, so that's philanthropy. Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. So anytime you see phil in this class, and you'll see it a couple more times, you need to know that means to love or to be attracted to. Perfect. Okay, so we've got this cell membrane. Here's a little nicer of a sketch of that phospholipid bilayer. And if you kind of 3D render this, you can get even a better idea of how this looks in real life. Except that this isn't the cell membrane. In other words, so far we're only showing the phospholipid bilayer. What about all these things we mentioned, like receptors that give cells sensitivity, and pumps to help with selective permeability? Where's all that stuff? Well, really, the phospholipid bilayer is embedded with all this other stuff. So the cell membrane looks something closer to this image. Very chaotic in a way, although perhaps you can see some kind of pattern here. There are all these structures on the outside of the cell here. There are some structures that cross all the way through from the inside of the cell to the outside. And this visual image maybe makes you think of a mosaic, which I'm not really into art so much as I am science, but I looked it up, right? Mosaics, for example, would be when you have a bunch of different colored pieces of glass and you can make this image or pattern from them. So the cell membrane is a bunch of different little proteins and fats and carbohydrates and molecules, and you put them all together to form the cell membrane. Here are a few specific elements of the cell membrane we'll talk about. For example, number 1, glycocalyx. Glyco means carbohydrates. A calyx is a cup. I'm not sure how they named this thing, but the glycocalyx is a viscous and carbohydrate-rich barrier on the outside of the cell. This is going to help protect the cell. It's going to allow the cell to have some stickiness and to identify the cell. Let's talk about that a little more. So when I say protection from the glycocalyx, I mean that the phospholipid bilayer is kind of fragile. So by adding this glycocalyx, which all of these little orange branchy structures here make up the glycocalyx, that's an extra little buffer of protection. When I say stickiness, I mean, depending on the cell, some cells are very good at attaching to things. A lot of bacteria are good at this. Like if you get some sliminess to the inside of your shower or something, that's from bacteria. They're attaching to your shower wall with their glycocalyx, and it makes that sliminess and difficult to clean. And a self versus non-self marker means that your immune system can identify your own cells from the glycocalyx, because my cells will have a slightly different glycocalyx than your cells. So, another element of the cell membrane is proteins. A lot of different types of proteins. They can be receptors, they can form enzymes to help get work done, they can form channels. And there's a few different types. Peripheral proteins, as the term periphery suggests, are on the edge, meaning they're either on the inside of the cell membrane or on the outside of the cell membrane, attached to the edge. Integral proteins are embedded in the cell membrane, and protein channels are especially important in allowing ions to pass in and out of the cell. We can see a lot of the proteins here. This is some kind of protein channel. We can see some little red structures moving through that channel. And last, cholesterol helps to stabilize the cell membrane. The cell membrane is kind of like olive oil in consistency. It's pretty fluid still, it's goopy. And you don't want it to be too hard and rigid, and you don't want it to be too dilute and just wash away. So cholesterol helps manage that particular level of viscosity of the cell membrane. So here's a diagram where you can see each of those carbohydrate chains that help form the glycocalyx, a few different kinds of proteins, the phospholipid bilayer, of course, and some cholesterol molecules helping stabilize that membrane. Okay, so we said the cell membrane can also assist with cell-to-cell communication, adhesion, and so on. So the junction between two cell membranes is where some of this is accomplished. In other words, if you're not a erythrocyte, if you're not a red blood cell floating free through the blood vessels, but you are another type of cell in the skin or lining the intestines or something, those cells do attach to each other. So in what ways do they attach to each other? Well, they may be fused very tightly to each other in what we call tight junctions. So imagine just little drips of epoxy or whatever your favorite extremely strong adhesive material is. It's going to essentially fuse the cell membranes together. And one place in the body you'd want something like this is on the apical surface, meaning the top. This is the apex of these cells on the top. The top of the cells will be fused together so things can penetrate into your body through your skin cells, forming a very tight barrier. Desmosomes have these strands or filaments that serve as anchors to help resist stress. So again, in the skin, you might have these because the skin is subject to a lot of pulling and bending as our bodies move or interact with the environment. But as the heart beats, those cells are definitely subject to a lot of stress. Contracting and relaxing for your whole life. So they have desmosomes to help resist that stress. And finally, gap junctions are like little hollow cylinders. So they help facilitate communication between the cells. And some cells where you would really need that close communication would be like in a lot of your muscle tissue. As that cardiac muscle contracts and relaxes, you really need that to help happen in an organized manner. You can't have some cells contracting off rhythm with the neighboring cells, or your heart won't beat efficiently.